Hello there, and welcome back. Tonight we are going to ride slowly into one of the colder shadows of Red Dead Redemption 2, the lore of Colm O'Driscoll. Colm is not on screen as often as Dutch van der Linde, Arthur Morgan, Micah Bell, or the members of the gang we live beside, but his presence hangs over the story from the beginning, like old blood in the snow. He is the leader of the O'Driscoll boys, Dutch's bitter rival, the man tied to Annabelle's death, the man whose gang murders Jake Adler, breaks Sadie Adler's life open, kidnaps and tortures Arthur, destroys Kieran Duffy, and finally meets the gallows in Saint Denis, with all his confidence slipping from his face. So settle in gently. Let the fire burn low. Let the mountain wind quiet down. Tonight we are following Colm O'Driscoll, not as a hero, not as a mystery to admire, but as one of the clearest examples of what outlaw life looks like when loyalty has rotted into numbers, revenge, and fear. Colm O'Driscoll matters because he is more than Dutch's enemy. He is Dutch's dark mirror, but not in the simple way Micah is. Micah reflects Dutch's selfishness and cruelty from inside the van der Linde gang. Colm reflects Dutch from outside it. Both men are outlaw leaders. Both men command loyalty. Both men build families of violence around themselves. Both men speak as if their own survival is reason enough for others to die. But where Dutch covers his crimes in ideals, speeches, freedom, brotherhood, and visions of a better world, Colm seems colder, plainer, and more practical. He does not need to pretend his gang is noble in the same romantic way. He needs men, guns, fear, and advantage. The O'Driscoll boys are one of the largest hostile gangs in Red Dead Redemption 2, and their size is part of Colm's character. Dutch's gang is intimate. It is a community of named people with personal histories, romances, grudges, chores, songs, and private fears. Colm's gang feels more like a criminal swarm. The men are numerous, replaceable, and often disposable. This contrast is important. Dutch may be destructive, but he wants to believe his people are family. Colm's organisation suggests something harsher, a gang where belonging means usefulness until death, capture, or replacement. That difference is one of the first things Kieran Duffy helps reveal. Kieran was once with the O'Driscolls, but he does not describe them like a man remembering a loving home. He comes across as frightened, used, and trapped by a gang that did not truly value him. He was a stable hand, not a hardened killer by nature, and his time with the O'Driscolls seems to have been shaped by fear more than loyalty. Through Kieran, Colm's leadership style becomes clearer. Colm is not raising sons the way Dutch likes to imagine he is. He is feeding a machine. Colm's exact early life is not deeply explained in the story, and that absence suits him. He feels less like a man with a tender origin, and more like a name that already existed in violence before the game begins. We know him through consequences, dead lovers, dead brothers, rival gangs, burned homes, captured men, ambushes, and gallows. The story does not ask us to pity Colm's childhood or trace his first wrong turn. It lets him arrive as the product of an older outlaw world, a man who has already spent years learning that fear can be organised. The feud between Colm and Dutch stretches back before the events of the game, and it carries the emotional weight of an old wound no one has allowed to close. Dutch killed Colm's brother, whose name is never given in the main story. In retaliation, Colm killed Annabelle, a woman Dutch loved. These two deaths form the core of the hatred between them. The fact that Colm's brother remains unnamed, while Annabelle is remembered more personally, tells us something about how the story frames the feud. For Dutch, Annabel becomes sacred memory, a wound wrapped in romance. For Colm, the brother's death becomes reason enough for vengeance, but the man himself remains almost swallowed by the violence that followed. Annabel's death is one of the most important unseen events in Dutch van der Linde's life, and Colm is forever tied to it. Dutch speaks of Annabel as someone whose loss still hurts him, even years later. Her murder is one of the reasons Dutch's hatred of Colm has a special heat. This is not just business. It is not just rivalry over territory or money. Colm killed someone Dutch loved, and Dutch killed someone Colm loved, or at least someone bound to Colm by blood. Their feud becomes a circle where grief has turned into identity. The tragedy is that neither man seems capable of allowing grief to remain grief. They turn it into violence, and violence becomes proof that the grief mattered. Dutch kills Colm's brother. Colm kills Annabel. Dutch hunts Colm. Colm hunts Dutch. Men who never met Annabel or Colm's brother die years later because two leaders cannot stop using the dead as fuel. This is one of Red Dead Redemption 2's sharpest ideas. Old wounds do not stay private when powerful men build gangs around them. Colm's rivalry with Dutch also reveals how outlaw leaders use personal pain to create collective violence. The ordinary O'Driscoll boys did not all lose Colm's brother. The ordinary van der Linde members did not all love Annabel. Yet the feud becomes theirs. Men ride, shoot, ambush, kidnap and die because leaders carry old stories into new orders. The feud is inherited by people who may barely understand its beginning. By the time Arthur Morgan meets O'Driscolls in 1899, the hatred is almost automatic, like weather. This automatic hatred is visible in the opening chapter. The Van der Linde gang is freezing in the Grizzlies after the Blackwater disaster, and almost immediately the O'Driscolls appear as nearby enemies. Dutch leads Arthur and Micah toward a homestead where O'Driscoll men have taken shelter. The place is Adler Ranch, and what they find there introduces the O'Driscoll boys not through speeches, but through violation. Jake Adler is dead. Sadie Adler is hidden in the cellar. Her home has been invaded, looted, and destroyed. The O'Driscolls arrive in the story as men who ruin a household. Adler Ranch is essential to Colm's lore, even though Colm himself is not standing there. A leader's gang reveals him. The men under Colm's name have murdered Jake Adler and terrorised Sadie, and the aftermath becomes one of the most emotionally important origins in the game. Sadie is not merely rescued from danger, her old life is over. The O'Driscoll attack creates the widow, who will later help watch Colm die and eventually help destroy the remnants of his gang. In this way, Colm's violence plants one of the forces that will come back for him. Sadie's story is one of the great examples of consequence in Red Dead Redemption 2. The O'Driscolls think they have taken a home, killed a man, and left behind only wreckage. They do not understand that they have created an enemy whose grief will harden into purpose. Colm's gang is used to making victims, but Sadie does not remain only a victim. Her transformation begins in the cellar of a ruined home, and Colm's name becomes attached to the worst day of her life. This gives Colm's presence a personal meaning for Sadie that differs from Dutch's. Dutch hates Colm because of Annabel and years of rivalry. Sadie hates the O'Driscolls because their violence took her husband, her home, and her former self. Her hatred is newer, rawer, and less theatrical. Dutch's hatred is old and almost ritualised. Sadie's is intimate and practical. When she eventually watches Colm hang, she is not simply assisting Dutch. She is looking at the symbol of the world that destroyed her. The first O'Driscoll camp raid in the Grizzlies also introduces Kieran Duffy. After the gang attacks the O'Driscolls, Kieran is captured and brought back as a prisoner. His presence gives the feud a human complication. To Arthur and the gang, Kieran is an O'Driscoll, and that label nearly erases everything else about him. He is tied to a tree, threatened, mocked, starved of trust, and treated as if the gang he belonged to defines him completely. Colm's gang has marked him so deeply that even when he leaves it, the mark follows. Kieran's fear of both gangs is important. He knows the O'Driscolls are cruel, but he also knows the Van der Lindes might kill him. He sits between two violent families, belonging fully to neither. Through him, Colm's world becomes less abstract. We see what it does to weaker men. Kieran is not presented as a strong believer in Colm's cause. He is a small man caught in the machinery of gangs, trying to survive long enough for someone to see that he is not the enemy everyone keeps naming him as. Colm's recruitment style seems to favour quantity over depth. The O'Driscolls are numerous, scattered, and often not deeply individualised. This is not weak writing, it is part of their function. They are the opposite of Dutch's intimate camp. Colm's strength comes from volume. If one man dies, another can take his place. If one hideout is raided, another group remains somewhere else. This makes the O'Driscolls dangerous in a different way from the Van der Lindes. Dutch's gang is emotionally dense. Colm's gang is numerically heavy. That numerical strength gives Colm a kind of crude power. He can lose men and keep operating. Dutch cannot. Every death in Dutch's gang matters because the family is small, named, and socially interwoven. When Davy dies, when Jenny dies, when Sean is captured, when Hosea dies, when Lenny dies, the gang changes. O'Driscoll deaths, by contrast, often seem absorbed by the organisation. This makes Colm's gang feel less human, but more durable. It is a cruel advantage. The 6-point cabin raid in Chapter 2 expands this contrast. Kieran leads Arthur, John and Bill to an O'Driscoll hideout, where they hope to find Colm. Colm is not there, but the raid shows the O'Driscolls as a constant regional presence. They have camps, cabins, patrols, plans, and enough men to create trouble wherever the Van der Lindes settle. Colm's absence is almost as important as his presence. His men die while he remains elsewhere. That is one of his patterns. Kieran saving Arthur during the 6-point cabin raid is one of the most important moments connected to Colm's lore, because it breaks the label O'Driscoll apart. Kieran kills an O'Driscoll to protect Arthur, proving with action what words could not prove. He is not loyal to Colm. He is not waiting to betray the Van der Lindes. He wants to live, and perhaps he wants to belong somewhere less cruel. This act begins his slow acceptance in the camp, though never fully enough to save him. The fact that Kieran has to save Arthur to be partially believed says a great deal about the power of Colm's name. Being associated with Colm makes a man guilty until nearly impossible proof arrives. The O'Driscoll identity functions like a stain. Kieran may have been forced, frightened or trapped, but the rival gang's hatred does not allow nuance easily. Colm's cruelty spreads beyond his own choices. It shapes how others treat anyone who has been near him. Colm himself is not introduced as a man of warmth or charisma in the same way Dutch is. He has a rough charm of his own, but it is colder and more mocking. He does not need the grand philosophical language Dutch uses. When Colm speaks, there is often a sense that he understands violence as transaction. A truce can be bait, a meeting can be a trap, a prisoner can be currency. A man can be tortured not only for information, but for leverage. Colm's mind is tactical in a blunt, nasty way. This is what makes Blessed Are the Peacemakers such a defining mission. Dutch agrees to meet Colm under the idea of peace talks, while Micah and Arthur accompany him with suspicion. The very title carries irony. Peace is not truly coming. Colm is not seeking reconciliation, he is setting up a trap. Arthur watches from a distance, is overwhelmed, and becomes Colm's prisoner. The mission reveals Colm's greatest talent, turning the language of negotiation into a weapon. The meeting between Dutch and Colm is fascinating because it places the two leaders face to face after years of hatred. They look like men who know one another too well and respect one another too little. Their words circle old wounds, old betrayals, and the possibility of making peace. But the air is poisoned from the start. Neither man truly believes in peace. Dutch comes because part of him cannot resist the drama, and Colm comes because he has already planned the advantage. Colm's trap against Arthur is one of the coldest acts in the story. He does not capture Arthur simply to kill him immediately. He tortures him, holds him, and intends to use him as bait or leverage so that Dutch's gang will come looking and walk into a worse situation. This reveals how Colm thinks of people, not as souls, not as sons, not as friends, but as pieces on a board. Arthur is valuable because of who will suffer for him. The torture at the O'Driscoll camp is brutal because it strips Arthur of his usual control. Arthur is normally the man sent to solve problems, collect debts, break doors, and rescue others. Under Colm's men, he becomes wounded, bound, beaten, and vulnerable. Colm's world turns Arthur from enforcer into object. The scene is one of the few times Arthur is forced to endure what many weaker people endure under violent men: helplessness under someone else's power. Colm's intention in capturing Arthur reveals a difference between rivalry and cruelty. A simple enemy might kill Arthur for revenge. Colm wants Arthur's suffering to produce more suffering. He wants Dutch to react. He wants men to come. He wants a trap layered inside a trap. This makes him dangerous not because he is physically stronger than Arthur or more charismatic than Dutch, but because he understands how loyalty can be exploited. Dutch's gang loves Arthur, so Colm turns that love into bait. Arthur's escape from the O'Driscoll camp is one of his strongest survival moments. Wounded and weakened, he burns his wound, frees himself, kills men, reaches a horse, and rides back to Clemen's Point barely alive. The scene shows Arthur's toughness, but it also shows the O'Driscoll's brutality. Colm's gang does not merely fight. It degrades, it mutilates, it leaves men half dead and expects fear to finish the work. Arthur's return to camp after the kidnapping is emotionally strange because he was not rescued. He saves himself. This matters for Colm's lore because the trap fails partly due to Arthur's resilience and partly due to the gang's uncertainty or delay. Colm counts on loyalty functioning in predictable ways, but Arthur's own stubborn will breaks the design. Even so, the experience leaves a mark. Colm has touched Arthur's body with pain in a way few enemies do. Blessed Are the Peacemakers also exposes Dutch's weakness. Dutch walks into the situation despite suspicion, despite the long history with Colm, and despite Arthur being placed in danger. His old rivalry clouds judgment. Colm knows this. The feud gives both men handles by which they can be moved. Dutch wants to confront, prove, and perhaps dominate the old enemy. Colm uses the meeting to humiliate him indirectly. Their hatred becomes predictable, and predictability is dangerous. Micah's presence in that mission adds another uncomfortable layer. Micah pushes, comments, and participates in the setup, already representing the kind of internal danger that will later become worse than Colm. Colm is an external enemy. Micah is an internal infection. But during the peace meeting, both forms of danger seem to brush against Arthur at once. The story is beginning to show that Dutch's worst threats do not all wear O'Driscoll colours. Colm's relationship to law is also important. He is an outlaw, but he is not above using law when useful. By the time of his capture and planned execution, his gang has a plan to rescue him. But his own earlier actions suggest he understands systems of power pragmatically. He does not romanticize outlaw honour. He uses whatever keeps him alive. If a truce can be a trap, then peace is not sacred. If a prisoner can be bait, then loyalty is not sacred. If law can be dodged or manipulated, then justice is only another obstacle. This lack of romantic honour separates Colm from Dutch in presentation. Dutch often lies through ideals. Colm does not seem burdened by the need to sound noble. This can make him appear less complex at first, but it also makes him frighteningly efficient. He is what Dutch might look like if stripped of poetry. Dutch wants people to love him while they die for him. Colm seems content if they fear him or obey him long enough to be useful. Yet Colm is not simply stupid brutality. His traps show planning. His gang's size shows organisation. His survival across years of feud shows caution and adaptability. He may be less eloquent than Dutch, but he has lasted. That longevity matters. A man does not become Dutch van der Linde's legendary enemy by being merely a random thug. Colm is a leader of consequence, even if his style is uglier and less intimate. The O'Driscoll boys spread across multiple regions gives him reach. They appear in the Grizzlies, in New Hanover, around camps and cabins, in ambushes, and later through larger hideouts such as Hanging Dog Ranch. This reach makes Colm feel like a shadow network, not just a single gang camp. Wherever the Van der Lindes go in the earlier and middle parts of the story, the O'Driscolls can appear like old anger taking human form. Random O'Driscoll camps and encounters add to that atmosphere. A small group by a fire, men riding along a trail, an ambush, or a cabin full of enemies can make the feud feel constant. Colm does not need to be present for his name to matter. His organisation turns landscape into threat. A quiet ride through open country can suddenly become another reminder that Colm's men are there, armed and waiting. This is how a gang leader becomes environmental law. The attack on Adler Ranch also shows the O'Driscolls as opportunists. They do not arrive as soldiers in some formal feud. They occupy a vulnerable house in a storm, use what they can, and leave devastation behind. That is a different kind of evil from a planned duel or an ideological robbery. It is the evil of men who see shelter, supplies, food, warmth, and human weakness as things to seize, because nobody is strong enough to stop them yet. Colm's name hangs over that opportunism, even when he is not physically in the room. The winter setting makes this even harsher. In the mountains, shelter is life. To take a home in that weather is not only theft, it is domination over the most basic human need. The O'Driscolls turn warmth into threat. They take a place that should protect people from snow and make it more dangerous than the storm outside. This tells us early that Colm's men are not merely rivals to Dutch. They are a danger to anyone unlucky enough to stand between them and comfort. The burning of Adler Ranch after the confrontation adds another layer of finality. Seddy's old life does not remain as a home she might return to. It becomes a memory marked by fire, smoke, and ruin. Colm may not strike the match himself, but his gang's presence brings the destruction that makes her past unreachable. That is one of the cruelest forms of violence, not only killing a loved one, but making the place of love unlivable. Jake Adler's death is important because he is almost entirely known through absence. We do not spend time with him alive, yet his death shapes one of the strongest arcs in the game. This is how Colm's violence often works. It creates absences that become more powerful than long speeches. Jake's absence creates Sadie's grief. Annabelle's absence feeds Dutch's hatred. Colm's brother's absence fuels retaliation. Kieran's absence later haunts the camp. Colm's story is full of people known by the space they leave. Absence is a kind of law in Red Dead Redemption 2. The world is not only built from people we meet, but from people who are already gone. Colm is tied to several of these ghosts. The game gives just enough information to make them matter, then lets their consequences speak. This is why Colm's story can feel large, despite limited screen time. He stands near the places where lives have been removed. The O'Driscoll boys also function as a pressure system around the early camps. At Coulter, they are immediate danger. Around Horseshoe, they are local threat. Around Clemens Point, Colm himself turns peace into a trap. Around Shady Bell, their revenge arrives through Kieran's mutilated body. This repeated pressure gives the gang no clean emotional distance from the feud. Even when Dutch is trying to deal with other problems, Colm's world keeps returning. 6 Point Cabin deserves a deeper place in Colm's lore because it shows the O'Driscolls as a lived-in criminal network rather than a single moving posse. The cabin is rough, hidden, and occupied by men who seem to belong naturally to a life of waiting, drinking, guarding, and violence. Colm is not there, but the space feels like him. A leader's culture can be sensed in the places his men inhabit. 6 Point Cabin feels temporary, mean, and ready to be abandoned if enough bodies fall. Kieran guiding the Van der Lindes to 6 Point Cabin is a moment of dangerous betrayal against Colm. For Kieran, it is survival and proof. For the O'Driscolls, it would be unforgivable. This is where the terrible logic of gang belonging appears. A man who was never truly valued by Colm can still be treated as property when he leaves. Kieran was disposable while inside the gang, yet punishable as a traitor once outside it. Colm's system wants both, no real care, total control. The raid itself shows how easily gang war becomes routine. Men approach, shoot, search, loot, question, and move on. The cabin is cleared, bodies fall, and the feud continues. There is no ceremony, no deep political meaning, no victory that ends the conflict. This routine quality is part of the horror. Feuds can become work. Killing can become an errand. Colm and Dutch have turned old grief into repeated labour for younger men. The fact that Colm is absent from 6 Point Cabin also gives him an almost frustrating slipperiness. Dutch wants him. Arthur wants him. The gang rides out expecting perhaps to strike at the head, and finds only limbs. Colm remains elsewhere, protected by distance and numbers. This absence makes him feel less like a gunfighter waiting for a showdown, and more like an organiser whose real talent is not being where the bullets land. That talent appears again and again. Colm's men occupy spaces, but Colm survives behind them. He lets the gang's bulk absorb danger. In a different kind of story, this might be called cowardice. In outlaw strategy, it is also survival. Colm understands that a leader who is always at the front dies quickly. Dutch likes to perform bravery. Colm prefers the advantage of layers. The layers around Colm make him hard to reach emotionally as well as physically. We rarely see him tender, uncertain, or alone until the gallows. He is protected by reputation, men, history, and cruelty. The story keeps him at a distance because his power operates at a distance. He does not need to sit in every scene. His name can do work for him. This makes Colm's final isolation more dramatic. For much of the story, he is buffered by men. At the gallows, all buffers fail. The state strips away the layers. No camp, no cabin, no ridge, no ambush, no men between him and consequence. He stands above the crowd as a single body. The ending reverses his whole method. A man who survived through distance is brought into public closeness with death. Hanging Dog Ranch, later occupied by the O'Driscolls, is the opposite of that final isolation, because it shows the gang's remaining mass. The place feels like a hard outpost, armed and settled into violence. Its name already sounds harsh, and by the time Sadie and Arthur attack it, the ranch carries the weight of revenge. This is not a small campfire encounter, it is a clearing of one of the last major O'Driscoll strongholds. The location of Hanging Dog Ranch in Big Valley also gives the O'Driscolls a western reach beyond the early heartlands. Their influence is not trapped in one county, they are scattered across the map's emotional geography. From the Snowy Grizzlies to New Hanover Cabins to West Elizabeth Ranchland, Colm's organisation stretches like a stain. That reach makes his gang feel like an infestation of the dying outlaw world. The ranch's later emptiness after the O'Driscolls are dealt with can feel like the silence after a disease has burned out. The buildings remain, the land remains, but the name has lost its living force. This is one of the quiet ways Red Dead Redemption 2 handles aftermath. Places outlast the gangs that use them. A ranch can be a home, a hideout, a battlefield, and then something else again. Colm's men are temporary occupants of a world that will not remember them kindly for long. The O'Driscoll boys in Red Dead Online, appearing as a hostile gang in the broader world, also suggest how Colm's name functions beyond Arthur's immediate story. The gang identity becomes part of the region's criminal fabric. Even when separated from the exact path of the Van der Lindes, the O'Driscoll name carries a meaning, violence, ambush, outlaw pressure, and a recognisable kind of threat. A gang leader's lore can spread into the general air of a world. The way O'Driscolls talk and behave often suggests a lower, rougher version of outlaw culture. They are not dressed in Dutch's ideals. They do not carry the same sense of chosen family. They are coarse, violent, and interchangeable, which again reflects Colm's leadership. A gang takes the shape of its leader over time. Dutch's people argue about morality, because Dutch speaks in morality. Colm's men behave like men trained to expect disposability. This disposability becomes central in Colm's execution. When Colm is captured and sentenced to hang in St Denis, the O'Driscoll boys prepare a rescue plan. At first, Colm seems confident. He believes his men will get him out. That confidence tells us he is used to being protected by numbers. He expects the machine he built to function for him. But Dutch, Arthur and Sadie identify the O'Driscolls' position to intervene, including the sniper waiting to cover the escape. One by one, the plan is cut apart. The execution mission, Goodbye Dear Friend, is one of the most satisfying and quietly chilling moments in the story. Colm is brought to the gallows in Saint Denis, surrounded by law, crowd and spectacle. He tries to remain composed because he believes he is still in control. Then he sees the signs that the rescue has failed. The confidence leaves his face. For perhaps the first time, Colm O'Driscoll truly understands that no one is coming. That realization is more important than the hanging itself. Colm's power has always depended on men beyond him. Men who can shoot, ambush, rescue, replace, and continue. On the gallows, that power collapses into one body with a rope around its neck. The leader of many becomes a single frightened man. The system of disposability turns back on him. His men die or fail, and there is no one left to absorb the consequence for him. Sadie being present at Colm's execution gives the scene deep emotional closure. The O'Driscolls destroyed her home and killed her husband. Now she watches the man whose name stands at the top of that violence-faced public death. Her presence is not soft. It is not gentle forgiveness. It is hard, cold witness. For Sadie, Colm's hanging does not restore Jake or rebuild the ranch, but it gives a shape to vengeance. The name behind the nightmare is no longer untouchable. Dutch's presence at the execution is more complicated. He gets to see his old enemy die, the man who murdered Annabelle, the man connected to years of feud. But by chapter 6, Dutch himself is already deep in decline. Watching Colm hang does not purify him or heal him. Revenge does not make Dutch better. If anything, the scene is haunted by the fact that Colm's death removes an old enemy, while Dutch's own corruption remains very much alive. Arthur's presence is also layered. Colm tortured him, and Arthur has personal reason to want him dead. Yet Arthur by chapter 6 is sick, morally clearer, and increasingly aware that revenge is not salvation. Colm's execution is satisfying in a practical sense because a dangerous man is gone, but the story does not become lighter afterward. Arthur still dies, Dutch still fails, Micah still poisons, the Pinkertons still close in. Colm's death solves the Colm problem. It does not solve the world. The public nature of Colm's hanging matters because it shows the outlaw era being processed by law. Colm, once a dangerous gang leader, becomes a condemned body on a platform. The crowd gathers to watch. The city turns his death into order, ceremony, and warning. This is very different from an outlaw shootout in the woods. Colm is not killed in a romantic duel. He is executed by the state, while his enemies disguise themselves among the mechanisms of that state to make sure he dies. Saint Denis is the perfect place for this ending because it represents modernity, crowd, law, bureaucracy, and spectacle. Colm's world is older: camps, cabins, ambushes, rival gangs, mounting grudges. His death in Saint Denis feels like the old outlaw violence being swallowed by a larger machine. He may have been powerful in the woods, but in the city he is a prisoner in a formal procession. His name still matters, but his body is handled by law. This does not make the law pure. Red Dead Redemption 2 is never that simple. Public execution is its own form of violence. The crowd's appetite is unsettling. Dutch and Sadie manipulate the event for their own revenge. The state kills Colm not because it is morally flawless, but because it has the power to name its killing justice. Colm's death shows the difference between outlaw violence and institutional violence. One is illegal, the other wears a schedule and a rope. Colm's fear on the gallows humanises him without redeeming him. For most of the story, he is a name attached to cruelty. In the final moment, he becomes a man realising death is immediate. This does not excuse him, it only reminds us that even cruel men are mortal. The rope does not hang a legend, it hangs a breathing body. The terror in his face is the collapse of every story he told himself about control. After Colm's death, the O'Driscoll boys are weakened, but the violence he organised does not vanish instantly. A leader can die and still leave men behind with habits, hatred, and nowhere better to go. This is part of the tragedy of gang life. It creates people suited for violence and then removes the structure that aimed them. The remaining O'Driscolls become remnants of a dead man system, still dangerous because systems outlive the men who benefit from them. Sadie Adler, Widow 2, gives the last major blow to the O'Driscolls when Sadie and Arthur attack Hanging Dog Ranch. This mission is deeply tied to Colm, even though he is already dead. Sadie is not satisfied by the leaders hanging alone. The men who destroyed her life, or men of the same gang and same culture of violence, still remain. Hanging Dog Ranch becomes the place where the O'Driscoll presence is finally torn out more directly. Hanging Dog Ranch is important because it feels less like a random hideout and more like the last heavy nest of Colm's world. The ranch is fortified, violent, and full of men who represent the remaining O'Driscoll force. Sadie's attack is personal, and Arthur's participation is one of the late acts of loyalty and care he offers her. Colm may be gone, but the gang he built still has to be answered. Sadie's violence at Hanging Dog Ranch is not clean healing. It is grief armed to the teeth. She has become capable, terrifying, and determined, but the pain underneath remains. Colm's gang created this version of Sadie by destroying the earlier one. That does not make her only a product of them, because her strength is her own, but it does mean their cruelty helped set her path. In the end, O'Driscoll violence returns to the O'Driscolls through the woman they failed to kill. Arthur's presence with Sadie during that mission is moving because he understands revenge and also understands its limits. By chapter 6, Arthur is tired, sick, and increasingly focused on helping others more than settling every score. Yet he goes with Sadie. He does not dismiss her grief. He helps her face the remnants of the gang that ruined her life. This connects Colm's lore to Arthur's late redemption. Arthur cannot undo what happened at Adler Ranch, but he can stand beside Sadie when she confronts its aftermath. Kieran's death is another of the O'Driscolls' most horrific legacies. Captured by the gang he once escaped, he is tortured, killed, and sent back to Shady Belle in a grotesque display, headless and used as psychological warfare. This act shows the O'Driscolls at their most monstrous. Kieran's crime, in their eyes, is leaving and belonging elsewhere. Colm's culture does not forgive defection. It makes an example. Kieran's death also proves that the Van der Linde gang never fully protected him until it was too late. He was distrusted for being an O'Driscoll, yet the O'Driscolls kill him for becoming a Van der Linde. He dies between identities, punished by the old gang and never fully embraced by the new one. Colm's shadow falls heavily here. Even if Colm did not personally hold the knife, the gang culture under his name produces the kind of cruelty that makes Kieran's end possible. The attack that follows Kieran's body returning to Shady Bell shows how the O'Driscolls weaponise horror. They do not simply kill a former member, they turn his body into a message and use the shock to launch an assault. This is psychological violence as much as physical violence. Colm's gang understands fear. It understands how to make enemies lose balance before bullets fly. That method reflects the same logic as Arthur's kidnapping. A person becomes bait, message, and weapon all at once. Kieran's death also deepens the contrast between Colm and Dutch. Dutch's gang is capable of cruelty toward Kieran, especially early on, but over time, some members begin to see him as a person. The O'Driscolls do not. Once Kieran leaves them, he becomes an example to be destroyed. This does not make Dutch's gang innocent, but it shows why Kieran might prefer them despite their flaws. Between two violent families, one at least slowly allowed him a name. Colm's legacy is therefore partly the destruction of people who are weaker than him. Sadie, Kieran, the unnamed men he sends into traps, the people terrorised by O'Driscoll camps, the victims of raids, all reveal a leadership built on consuming others. Dutch consumes people too, but often through love and belief. Colm consumes through fear and numbers. Both forms are deadly. Colm's is simply less decorated. The name O'Driscoll itself becomes a curse inside the Van der Linde camp. It is thrown at Kieran long after he has helped them. It is tied to threats, ambushes, dead friends, old grief and distrust. Colm's power extends through language. A name can make people stop listening to a person's actual story. Kieran is not Kieran first. He is O'Driscoll first, and that delay in being seen contributes to the sadness of his life. This is one of the subtler harms of Colm's gang. It turns identity into contamination. People associated with the O'Driscolls become suspect. Places associated with them become dangerous. Their camps feel dirty with threat. Their name alone can make Arthur reach for anger. Colm has built not only a gang, but a reputation that changes how others perceive the world. Reputation is a weapon, and Colm uses it even when absent. Dutch and Colm's feud also shows how masculine pride can keep violence alive long after its original cause has become almost abstract. Annabel and Colm's brother are dead. Nothing can restore them, yet their deaths remain active through the pride of surviving men. Neither Dutch nor Colm can allow the other to stand untouched. To let the feud go would feel like admitting the dead no longer matter. So more people die to prove that they do. This is a tragic misunderstanding of memory. Remembering Annabel does not require Dutch to keep feeding violence. Remembering Colm's brother does not require Colm to murder Annabel. But in their world, grief is often translated into retaliation, because retaliation feels like action. Stillness would mean sitting with pain, and men like Dutch and Colm are much better at moving pain outward. Their gangs become the direction pain travels. Colm's cruelty toward Annabel is especially revealing because he chooses someone Dutch loves rather than Dutch himself. That kind of retaliation aims at the heart through another body. It is not only killing, it is message making. Colm understands that hurting a beloved person can be more devastating than attacking the rival directly. This logic appears again later when Arthur is captured as bait. Colm repeatedly uses human attachments as pressure points. That talent makes him one of the story's most emotionally dangerous antagonists. He may not appear constantly, but when he acts, he attacks bonds. Annabel was a bond. Arthur is a bond. Kieran's corpse is a bond turned into horror. Sadie's marriage is destroyed by men under his banner. Colm's violence is often relational. It does not only kill individuals, it damages the connections that make life bearable. This is why he fits Red Dead Redemption 2 so well. The game is not only about survival, it is about bonds under pressure. Fathers and sons, brothers, lovers, friends, leaders and followers, families chosen and lost. Colm O'Driscoll is an antagonist who attacks bonds while commanding a gang, with very little true bond inside it. He is the enemy of connection, because his own system is built on replaceability. Dutch's system is different, but also doomed. He builds deep bonds and then exploits them. Colm builds shallow bonds and spends them freely. One might ask which is worse. Dutch's way hurts more intimately because people love him. Colm's way looks uglier from the start because people are tools. Red Dead Redemption 2 places these men opposite each other to show two faces of outlaw leadership. The family that becomes a trap, and the army that was always a meat grinder. Arthur's hatred of Colm is partly inherited from Dutch, partly earned through direct violence, and partly intensified by what the O'Driscolls do to people he knows. Arthur begins the story already trained to treat O'Driscolls as enemies. Then he sees Adler Ranch, captures Kieran, raids their camps, is tortured by them, watches their violence return through Kieran's death, and helps Sadie finish them. By the end, Colm is not an abstract rival. He is woven into Arthur's last months. Yet Arthur's own moral growth complicates simple hatred. He learns that being an O'Driscoll does not make Kieran worthless. He learns that Dutch's feud is not pure righteousness. He learns that revenge cannot save the gang. Colm remains evil in Arthur's world, but the existence of Colm does not make Dutch good. This is one of the story's mature insights. Having a worse enemy does not cleanse one's own sins. Dutch often uses enemies to define himself. Colm is useful to Dutch because he is clearly cruel, clearly dishonourable, clearly dangerous. Compared with Colm, Dutch can appear noble. He can say, "We are not like them." He can point to O'Driscoll brutality and make the Linde gang feel like the better family. But the story slowly reveals that moral comparison can become a hiding place. Being better than Colm is not the same as being good. Colm's existence, therefore, helps Dutch avoid self-knowledge. As long as Colm stands outside as a monster, Dutch can keep imagining himself as the visionary outlaw with principles. But Dutch's own choices keep undermining that image. He uses people, abandons people, lies, kills, and grows increasingly paranoid. Colm may be the obvious villain of the feud, but Dutch's downfall shows that a man can define himself against evil and still become corrupt. This makes Colm's death strangely anticlimactic in the larger moral arc, and that is not a weakness. When Colm hangs, one old enemy is gone, yet the story does not heal. Dutch does not become better. Arthur does not recover. The gang does not stabilise. Micah does not disappear. The Pinkertons do not stop. Colm's death is closure for one thread, but it also reveals that the deepest threats are now inside the Linde camp. In this sense, Colm's role is to show the old kind of enemy before the new kind takes over. The O'Driscolls are rival outlaws, camps, ambushes, feuds, revenge, Cornwall, the Pinkertons, St. Denis, and federal power are larger historical forces. Micah is internal betrayal. Dutch's ego is spiritual collapse. Colm belongs to the familiar outlaw world, and when he dies, that world feels smaller. The story moves beyond gang rivalry into something colder and more modern. Colm's hanging in St. Denis also symbolises that transition. An old outlaw rival dies not in a mountain shootout, but in a city under state authority. His men try to rescue him with old gang tactics, but the plan fails. Dutch, Arthur and Sadie help make sure it fails. The gallows finish what years of feud could not. The modern world takes the old outlaw leader and turns him into a public example. There is irony in Dutch helping the law's execution succeed. Dutch hates law, state power and civilization, yet he uses the law's gallows to remove Colm. This shows that Dutch's principles are flexible when revenge is involved. He may despise the system, but he is willing to let it kill his enemy. Colm's death therefore reveals not only Colm's vulnerability, but Dutch's hypocrisy. The outlaw who condemns civilization can still enjoy its rope. Sadie's role in the execution is less hypocritical and more personal. She is not pretending to make a grand political statement. She wants Colm dead because his gang destroyed her life. Her revenge is fierce, but it is honest about itself. That honesty makes her different from Dutch. Dutch wraps revenge in old speeches and brotherhood. Sadie does not need such decoration. She knows she hates them. Arthur's role sits between them. He has reason to hate Colm, but he is increasingly tired of hatred as a way of life. He participates because Colm is dangerous, because Sadie needs help, and because the old feud still has practical consequences. But Arthur's final months are not defined by triumph over Colm. They are defined by helping John, Abigail, Jack, and others escape the ruins. Colm's death is part of the road, not the destination. Colm O'Driscoll's personality, from what the story gives us, is built from confidence, mockery, cruelty, and a strong instinct for survival. He enjoys having advantage. He knows how to unsettle Dutch. He understands the uses of fear. He expects men to come for him when he is captured. He thinks in terms of traps and leverage. His final fear is powerful because it is the first time all those instincts fail at once. The moment he realises the rescue will not happen is almost a reversal of every life he has built. A man who treated others as disposable discovers that he too can be isolated. A leader whose power came from numbers discovers that the rope only needs one neck. A man who used fear as a weapon becomes afraid in public. His death is fitting not because it is noble, but because it strips away the structure that made him feel untouchable. Colm's death does not invite deep sympathy, but it does invite recognition of mortality. Red Dead Redemption 2 often lets bad men die with fear on their faces. This matters because villains are not demons in a simple moral painting. They are men who made choices, built systems, harmed others, and eventually faced consequence. Colm's fear does not absolve him. It makes the consequence feel real. The O'Driscoll boys, after Colm, become almost like a body without a head. They may remain violent, but the organising name is damaged. Sadie's final revenge against them feels like clearing out the last growth of an old disease. Yet even their disappearance does not make the world safe. Other gangs, other systems, and other violent men remain. Colm is one example of a larger world, not the only source of its cruelty. This is why his law connects to the larger Red Dead theme of cycles. Violence creates violence. Dutch kills Colm's brother. Colm kills Annabelle. O'Driscolls kill Jake Adler. Sadie kills O'Driscolls. O'Driscolls kill Kieran. Arthur and Sadie kill more O'Driscolls. Colm hangs. The sequence feels satisfying in moments, but as a whole it is exhausting. Each revenge answers pain by creating new pain, and the world keeps finding people willing to continue. The word boys in O'Driscoll Boys has a strange cruelty to it. It sounds almost informal, almost familial, but the gang itself feels anything but tender. These are not boys cared for by a father. They are men under a name, used in numbers, sent into danger. The name creates a false sense of belonging, just as outlaw gangs often do. Dutch calls his followers family. Colm calls his men boys. In both cases, language softens the fact that people are being led toward death. Kieran's story is the most painful proof of this. He is called an O'Driscoll long after the O'Driscolls have stopped being his people. The name traps him. The Van der Lindes distrust him because of it. The O'Driscolls murder him for leaving it. He cannot escape Colm's shadow, even by betraying Colm's men to save Arthur. This makes Kieran one of the saddest casualties of the feud, because his real self is smaller and gentler than the name forced onto him. Sadie is the other great transformed casualty. She survives the O'Driscolls, but survival changes shape. Her grief becomes vengeance, her domestic life becomes combat, and her future becomes restless. Colm's gang does not simply take Jake's life. It alters the direction of Sadie's entire existence. She becomes one of the strongest people in the story, but strength born from trauma is not simple victory. Colm's violence echoes inside everything she becomes. Arthur too is altered by Colm, though not as permanently as by Downes. The kidnapping and torture show him how vulnerable he can be, and they expose the gang's old feud as something capable of reaching into his body. He escapes, but the experience adds another scar to his final year. Colm is not the cause of Arthur's redemption, but he is part of the pressure that reveals the gang's fragility. Even Arthur Morgan can be taken. Dutch is altered by Colm most deeply through Annabelle. The loss becomes part of Dutch's emotional mythology. It may help explain some of his attachment to revenge, and his inability to let go of old narratives. Annabelle's death gives Dutch a wound he can point to forever. The danger is that a wound can become a throne. Dutch can sit on grief and rule from it, demanding loyalty because he has suffered. Colm gives him that grief, and Dutch turns it into identity. But Colm is not responsible for everything Dutch becomes. That distinction matters. Colm hurt Dutch. Colm murdered Annabelle. Colm deserves hatred for that. But Dutch still chooses how to lead, how to lie, how to use people, and how to respond to doubt. The feud explains some pain. It does not excuse later corruption. Red Dead Redemption 2 is careful with this. A man can be wounded and still responsible for the harm he causes. Colm's entire role in the story therefore invites comparison without absolution. Compared with Colm, Dutch looks warmer. Compared with Dutch, Colm looks more honest about being cruel. Compared with Micah, Colm looks like an older external danger rather than a hidden inner rot. Compared with Cornwall, Colm looks almost old-fashioned. Compared with the Pinkertons, he looks chaotic rather than institutional. He sits at the crossroads of outlaw violence, personal, organised, vengeful, and already being overtaken by larger forces. The Irishness of Colm's name and gang identity also adds texture to the world, though the story does not deeply explore his cultural background. His name marks him as part of the ethnic mix of the American outlaw frontier. Red Dead Redemption 2 is full of people from different origins, accents, communities and histories, all thrown into a violent country changing quickly. Colm's gang is not a formal ethnic organisation in the story, but his name gives him a distinct sound. a particular place in the chorus of Outlaw America. That sound matters because names in Red Dead Redemption 2 carry atmosphere. Linde sounds almost noble and old world. O'Driscoll sounds rough, clan-like and sharp around the edges. Cornwall sounds industrial and wealthy. Pinkerton sounds official and cold. These names are part of the world building. Colm O'Driscoll's name feels like it belongs on a wanted poster, shouted in anger or muttered before a raid. It has the ring of a feud. Colm is rarely given softness, and that absence is deliberate. Some villains are made tragic through glimpses of affection. Colm is made frightening through the lack of such glimpses. We hear of his brother, but not in a way that opens him tenderly. We see his confidence, his cruelty, and finally his fear. The story leaves his emotional interior mostly closed. This makes him feel less like a misunderstood man and more like a hardened product of the life Dutch claims to romanticise. In that sense, Colm is a warning about the outlaw myth stripped bare. No family songs, no speeches about helping the poor, no charming camp where people read and play dominoes. Just men, guns, stolen property, murdered homesteaders, kidnapped enemies, and a leader who expects disposable loyalty. If Dutch's gang is the myth of outlaw freedom decaying from within, Colm's gang is what the myth often looked like without the pretty language. This makes Colm necessary to the early chapters. The story needs the O'Driscolls to show that Dutch's gang can still look better by comparison. At Adler Ranch, the Van der Lindes rescue Sadie from O'Driscoll violence. At 6 Point Cabin, they attack men tied to a cruel leader. Through Kieran, they seem capable of accepting an enemy who proves himself. These contrasts make the Van der Lindes feel warmer, but they also set the trap of moral comfort. Better than Colm is a low bar. As the story progresses, the comparison becomes less comforting. Dutch's gang begins to lose the qualities that separated it from gangs like Colm's. Violence becomes more reckless. Loyalty becomes more conditional. People are left behind. Doubt is treated like betrayal. Micah gains influence. Dutch's speeches become thinner. By the time Colm hangs, the Van der Linde gang is no longer easily protected by the fact that the O'Driscolls were worse. This is why Colm's lore should be told as part of the whole decline, not as a side villain biography. He belongs to the story's moral architecture. He gives Dutch an enemy, Sadie an origin wound, Kieran a tragic label, Arthur a torture scar, and the outlaw world a rival model of leadership. He also gives the story a chance to show revenge succeeding and still not saving anyone. That is an important lesson. Colm's execution is satisfying because he deserves consequence. But satisfaction is not peace. Sadie still grieves. Arthur still dies. Dutch still falls. Kieran is still dead. Jake Adler is still dead. Annabelle is still dead. Colm's brother is still dead. The rope closes one life, but it does not unmake the chain of harm. Red Dead Redemption 2 lets the hanging feel good for a moment, then keeps the world heavy. The O'Driscoll feud also contributes to the sense that the past is always present. Before the game begins, important things already happened. Dutch killed Colm's brother. Colm killed Annabelle. Blackwater went wrong. Old rivalries formed. People were lost. The story begins in motion, with history already pressing against everyone. Colm's hatred is part of that pre-existing pressure. He is not born in Chapter 1. He arrives from years of unresolved violence. This makes the world feel older than the visible plot. A great Western story often needs the sense that every person has already lived too much before the first scene. Colm gives Dutch that history. He reminds us that Dutch was not always the man we meet in 1899, and that the gang's ideals have been tested by blood before. The feud is a window into an earlier era of robberies, alliances, betrayals, and lovers lost before Arthur's final year begins. There is a possible earlier closeness between Dutch and Colm, implied by how personal their feud feels. Whether they were ever friendly in a deep sense, or simply familiar through outlaw circles, their hatred carries the weight of men who know too much about each other. They are not strangers fighting over a score. They are old enemies shaped by old deaths. This makes their meetings feel heavy, even when the story gives only fragments. The missing details make the feud feel larger. The lack of a full prequel around Colm leaves space for imagination, but the known outline is enough. 2 outlaw leaders, a brother killed, a lover murdered, years of revenge, men recruited into a feud, a ruined ranch, a frightened stable hand, a tortured Arthur, a headless Kieran, a gallows in St. Denis, a final ranch assault. The law is not broad because Colm speaks often. It is broad because his violence touches so many lives. Colm's leadership style can be understood through absence of intimacy. We do not see him sitting tenderly with his men, feeding them, worrying over their futures, or speaking of dreams. We see his gang as function. That absence is the point. The O'Driscoll boys do not feel like a family collapsing. They feel like a violent organisation continuing until the leader is removed and the remnants are cut down. Colm built something strong enough to scare people, but not loving enough to mourn itself clearly. This lack of mourning is striking compared with the Van der Lindes. When someone in Dutch's gang dies, the camp changes. People speak differently. Songs fade. Grief alters the air. With O'Driscoll's, death is constant and impersonal. Men fall by the dozen in raids, ambushes and shootouts. Colm's system requires such impersonality. If every death mattered deeply, the gang could not operate at that scale. Disposable men must be emotionally flattened. The tragedy is that every disposable man still had a life. Red Dead Redemption 2 does not pause to name them all, but the thought matters. Colm's gang reduces them to numbers, and the story often presents them as enemies to be killed. Yet the horror of Colm's leadership is precisely that he can turn human lives into replaceable force. Even nameless O'Driscolls are part of his moral ledger. A leader who spends men easily is guilty not only for what he does to enemies, but for what he does to followers. This brings Colm close to the larger critique of leadership in the game. Dutch spends people while saying he loves them. Colm spends people without needing much love. Cornwall spends people through wages and private guards. The Pinkertons spend people through institutions and orders. Red Dead Redemption 2 is full of systems that turn bodies into tools. Colm's system is one of the rawest. The O'Driscoll boys' violence against Sadie also reveals how gangs attack domestic spaces. Adler Ranch is a home, not a battlefield. Jake and Sadie are a married couple trying to live in the mountains. The O'Driscolls turn that home into a crime scene. This is central to their menace. They do not only fight rival gunmen, they invade lives that are not prepared for war. Colm's world expands by making ordinary people pay for outlaw movement. Sadie's later hatred is therefore not only personal revenge, it is a response to the destruction of domestic safety. Her home was supposed to be outside the gang feud. The O'Driscolls made it part of the feud by using it. In Red Dead Redemption 2, the line between outlaw violence and ordinary life is constantly crossed. Colm's men cross it immediately in the opening chapter, showing what kind of story this will be. The fact that Dutch's gang rescues Sadie from the O'Driscolls complicates the moral picture. They save her, but they are criminals too. They shelter her, but they cannot give her back peace. They oppose Colm, but they also bring danger wherever they go. Sadie survives one violent gang because another violent gang takes her in. Horseshoe and later camps become her refuge, but also her training ground in vengeance. Colm's violence pushes her into Dutch's world, and Dutch's world shapes what she becomes. Kieran follows a similar pattern. He escapes Colm's world only by entering Dutch's. Neither world is safe, but Dutch's camp, at its best, contains enough warmth that Kieran can begin to belong. That possibility makes his death worse. Colm's gang does not simply kill an enemy. It kills the fragile hope that someone marked by the O'Driscolls might become something else. Kieran's death is Colm's worldview reasserting itself. No one leaves cleanly. Arthur's torture also carries this message. No one stands above the feud. Arthur may be Dutch's most trusted enforcer, but Colm can still reduce him to captive flesh. This undermines the illusion of heroic outlaw strength. A strong man can still be trapped. A feared man can still scream. A loyal man can still be used as bait. Colm's cruelty reveals vulnerability in the people Dutch's myth tries to make larger than life. Colm's eventual capture reveals the same truth in reverse. A feared gang leader can still be chained. A man who sent others to death can still be led to a platform. A name shouted across years can still end in a drop. Red Dead Redemption 2 is obsessed with this stripping away of legend. Dutch, Colm, Arthur, John, and many others are all eventually reduced to bodies facing consequence. Legend is loud. Mortality is quiet. Colm O'Driscoll's law is quietest after his death, because the silence he leaves says a great deal. The feud no longer has the same centre. The O'Driscoll name fades from the main story after the remnants are dealt with. Other problems take over. This fading is realistic. Even a feared man can vanish from the world quickly once dead. His victims remember, his enemies remember, but the road keeps moving. For Sadie, the memory does not vanish. Her later life remains shaped by what happened at Adler Ranch. She becomes a bounty hunter, a woman who lives by danger and pursuit. Colm is not solely responsible for every later choice she makes, but his gang's violence is the doorway through which her old life exits. That is a heavy legacy. A leader's men can destroy one home and alter a life for years. For Dutch, Colm's death removes one object of hatred, but not the need to hate. Dutch's mind simply finds other enemies, other betrayals, other explanations. This is important because it shows that Colm was never the true source of Dutch's instability. He was a major wound, yes, but Dutch's deeper problem is his relationship to reality, loyalty, and self-image. Killing the old enemy does not heal the leader who needed enemies to explain himself. For Arthur, Colm becomes one more part of the world he is leaving. The old rivalries, the old names, the old scores begin to matter less than saving John and helping those he can. Colm's death is part of the final sweep of consequences, but Arthur's heart is already turning elsewhere. This is a sign of Arthur's growth. He is no longer defined only by old feud. He is trying to choose a future for someone else. The O'Driscoll boys as a faction also represent the old outlaw world dying badly. They are not romantic rebels. They are violent men, increasingly hunted, increasingly cornered, living by raids, ambushes and fear. Their leader hangs, their hideouts are cleared, their name fades. The world that produced them does not vanish into honour. It is killed, arrested, replaced, or absorbed by harsher systems. Colm's death at the gallows shows that the state can defeat outlaw gangs physically, but the game does not present this as pure moral progress. The same modernising world that hangs Colm also empowers Cornwall, crushes native communities, uses Pinkertons, and turns people into economic tools. Colm is evil, but his defeat does not mean goodness has arrived. It means one form of violence is being superseded by others. This is why Red Dead Redemption 2's villains work so well together. Colm is not the final boss of evil. He is one piece. He shows gang violence. Cornwall shows capital power. Milton and Ross show state pursuit. Fusser shows imperial exploitation. Micah shows betrayal and selfish survival. Dutch shows corrupted idealism. Colm's role is specific. He is the old feud, the rival gang, the disposable army, the revenge cycle with a human face. The reason Colm can feel larger than his screen time is that his influence is distributed. He appears directly only at key moments, but his men, his history, and his consequences are everywhere in the early and middle story. A character does not need many scenes to have deep lore. Sometimes a few precise wounds are enough. Colm's wounds are precise. Annabelle, Adler Ranch, Kieran, Arthur, the gallows. The gallows scene also gives him one of the most memorable facial turns in the game. The shift from confidence to fear tells an entire life story without needing a monologue. He believed in his system until the moment the system failed him. He believed his men would come until the signs told him they would not. He believed control remained until the rope and crowd proved otherwise. That silent realisation is the truest portrait of Colm O'Driscoll. It is tempting to imagine Colm as fearless because he is cruel. The hanging proves otherwise. Cruelty is not courage. A man can make others suffer and still fear suffering himself. A man can send followers to die and still panic when death reaches him personally. This is one of the moral satisfactions of his end. He is forced to experience vulnerability, not as a lesson that redeems him, but as the final stripping away of his power. The O'Driscoll rescue plan failing also suggests that loyalty built on fear and utility has limits. His men do try to save him, but once the plan breaks, there is no deeper miracle. Fear can organise men, but it cannot guarantee devotion strong enough to overcome every obstacle. Dutch's gang, at its best, might risk everything for a loved member. Colm's gang seems to risk what the plan requires. When the plan dies, so does Colm. This does not mean the O'Driscolls were cowards. Many fight hard, many die violently. But the emotional structure is different. Their loyalty seems less like love and more like gang momentum. Colm's final terror may come partly from realising that his own organisation cannot love him out of death. It can only attempt tactics. Once tactics fail, he stands alone. Colm's brother, though unnamed, remains one of the great ghost figures behind the story. We know so little about him, yet his death helps ignite years of bloodshed. This is how feuds often work in fiction and life. The original person becomes less detailed over time, while the violence done in their name becomes more elaborate. The brother's humanity disappears behind the cause he becomes. Colm may have once mourned him as a person. By 1899, he functions mostly as fuel. Annabel too is a ghost, but a more emotionally vivid one, because Dutch's grief gives her shape. We never meet her, but her absence influences Dutch's hatred and perhaps his later emotional distance from Molly. She represents the woman Dutch could not save, or the love he turned into legend after loss. Colm's murder of Annabel is not only a crime against Dutch, it becomes part of Dutch's self-mythology, and that mythology affects everyone under Dutch's command. This means Colm influences the Van der Linde gang even before the game begins. Annabel's death helped shape Dutch's emotional life. Dutch's hatred of Colm helped shape gang priorities. The feud shaped how Arthur was taught to see O'Driscolls. Kieran's treatment in camp is shaped by that inherited hatred. Sadie's arrival is caused by O'Driscoll violence. Colm's lore is therefore threaded through the gang's internal culture, not merely its external conflicts. The tragedy of inherited hatred is that younger or newer members may never fully know the original wound. They receive the command to hate before receiving the history. Arthur knows enough, but men like Kieran suffer under the label. Sean, Lenny, Bill, Javier, and others participate in a feud that began before them. Colm and Dutch are the fathers of this hatred, and their followers are the sons paying interest on old blood. Interest is a fitting word, because Red Dead Redemption 2 often links debt and violence. Strauss's loans create moral debt, Dutch's speeches create emotional debt, Colm's feud creates blood debt. Everyone is paying someone. The O'Driscoll War is a debt that can never be settled, because each payment creates a new balance. Colm's hanging finally stops him, but it does not truly balance the books. Kieran's death remains unpaid in any simple sense. The O'Driscolls responsible may die, Colm may hang, Sadie may attack Hanging Dog Ranch, but Kieran does not return. Jake Adler does not return. Annabel does not return. The idea of balancing violence is exposed as a fantasy. Revenge can remove a perpetrator, but it cannot restore the stolen life. This is why the story feels mournful even after satisfying revenge scenes. Colm O'Driscoll is therefore best understood not as a man with a redemption arc, but as a man who reveals the cost of never seeking one. He does not turn, he does not soften, he does not confess, he does not try to repair. He remains himself until the rope. That makes him a fixed point, against which other characters change. Arthur changes, Sadie changes, Kieran tries to change, Dutch deteriorates, Colm stays hard, and then he breaks. His hardness is useful narratively, because it gives the story a clear antagonist while the central gang remains morally complex. In the early chapters, it helps to have O'Driscolls as enemies who can be fought without deep hesitation, but as the story deepens, even that clarity becomes complicated through Kieran and Sadie. The O'Driscoll name remains monstrous, yet individuals touched by it reveal pain, fear, and transformation. Colm stays clear, the world around him becomes less simple. This is one reason Colm's limited screen time works. If the story spent too long humanising him, he might pull focus away from the more important moral collapse of Dutch. Colm needs enough presence to matter, enough cruelty to define the feud, and enough final fear to feel mortal. He does not need to become the central tragedy. He is the external shadow that helps us see the internal tragedy more clearly. The internal tragedy is that Dutch, who hates Colm so deeply, eventually becomes capable of abandoning people with a coldness, not entirely unlike the rival he despises. He does not become Colm exactly. Dutch still speaks differently, feels differently, and carries different contradictions. But the distance between them shrinks as Dutch loses his better self. That shrinking distance is one of the story's quiet horrors. Colm would likely see Dutch's moral language as weakness or hypocrisy. Dutch would see Colm's blunt cruelty as proof of his own superiority. Both views contain truth and evasion. Colm is cruel. Dutch is hypocritical. Colm lacks romance. Dutch abuses romance. The world is worse for both of them. Their feud is not a battle between good and evil. It is a battle between two forms of outlaw ruin. At the end, Colm dies before Dutch, but Dutch's survival is not victory. Dutch lives long enough to lose almost everything, to kill or abandon parts of his family, to become a ghost of his own ideals, and eventually to die years later in another story. Colm's quick hanging may almost seem cleaner by comparison. Dutch's punishment is longer. He has to remain Dutch after the dream is gone. Colm's body drops. Dutch's myth lingers and rots. That contrast gives the feud its final shape. One enemy is physically executed, the other spiritually decays. Red Dead Redemption 2 is wise enough to show that death is not always the worst end. Sometimes survival after self-betrayal is its own slow gallows. If there is a single image that captures Colm's lore, it may be not his face on the gallows, but the line of influence stretching behind him. Adler Ranch burned into Sadie's memory, Kieran tied and trembling in camp, Arthur bleeding and crawling from captivity, Dutch speaking Annabelle's name like an old wound, O'Driscoll men waiting on rooftops to save a leader who finally cannot be saved. Colm is the centre of that web, even when absent. The web matters more than the man in some ways. Colm's personal psychology is not deeply opened, but his effect is. He makes fear, he makes enemies, he makes widows, he makes defectors, he makes traps. He makes Dutch worse by giving Dutch an enemy worthy of obsession. He makes Sadie harder. He makes Kieran's life impossible. He makes Arthur suffer. A character's lore is not only what is known about his childhood, it is what changes because he exists. Colm changes the emotional landscape of the game by giving the outlaw world a predator that even predators fear. The Van der Lindes are dangerous, but the O'Driscolls make them seem vulnerable. That vulnerability is important early on. It prevents Dutch's gang from feeling untouchable. They are hunted not only by law, but by rivals who know their language, their habits, and their history. Colm is danger from within the same species. This same species danger is different from Cornwall or Milton. Cornwall is money and industry. Milton is law and pursuit. Colm is outlaw violence, reflected back at outlaws. He knows the terrain of ambushes, grudges and gang loyalty, because he lives there too. He is not civilization coming for the wilderness. He is the wilderness eating itself. That makes him one of the last representatives of an older order of criminal feud. The older order is brutal, but it is also dying. Colm's hanging proves it. Dutch's later decline proves it. The O'Driscoll's destruction proves it. The Pinkertons and government pressure do not need to be morally pure to be historically effective. They are part of a world becoming too organised for men like Colm to remain kings of their little violent territories. The outlaw age does not end nobly. It gets processed, hunted, bought, or hanged. Colm probably understands some of this, at least practically. His gang size may be an attempt to survive the changing world through numbers. More men, more camps, more intimidation, more reach. Dutch tries to survive through charisma and dreams. Colm tries through expansion and fear. Both strategies fail. The world is too large, too networked, and too hungry for control. Outlaw leaders mistake motion for escape until the roads run out. The sadness of the O'Driscoll boys, if looked at quietly, is that many of them are likely poor, violent, desperate men drawn into a system that gives them identity and danger in place of a future. Colm uses that. He gives them a name, a gang, perhaps a share of stolen goods, and a target for anger. Then he spends them. In another story, some might have been workers, ranch hands, soldiers, drifters, or simply failed men. Under Colm, they become ammunition. This does not excuse them. The men at Adler Ranch choose horror. The men who kill Kieran choose horror. The men who torture Arthur choose horror. But understanding the gang as a system helps explain how Colm's power works. He does not need every man to be uniquely evil. He needs enough men willing to obey, enough fear to keep them moving, and enough violence to make the name O'Driscoll mean something. The name means danger in the mouths of the Van der Lindes. It means old hatred in Dutch's mouth. It means shame and fear around Kieran. It means devastation to Sadie. It means torture to Arthur. It means a rope in St. Denis by the end. A name gathers meanings through actions, and Colm O'Driscoll spends the story loading his name with blood until the law finally turns that name into a condemned announcement. His execution is public naming. The crowd hears who he is and what is happening to him. The state takes the outlaw name and puts it on display, saying, "This man who made others afraid is now under our control." Whether the crowd understands the deeper feud does not matter. Public punishment simplifies him. The law does what wanted posters do, turns a person into a name, crime, and consequence. Colm, who simplified so many lives into tools, is finally simplified by the gallows. The deeper story remains larger than the public event. The crowd does not know Annabelle the way Dutch does. It does not know Jake Adler the way Sadie does. It does not know Kieran's fear, Arthur's wound, or the countless small encounters with O'Driscoll men across the map. The hanging is the visible tip of a hidden mountain of violence. That hidden mountain is Colm's real law. There is no peaceful way for Colm to exit the world he built. A man who builds life from ambush, revenge, and disposable followers cannot retire softly. The logic of his world demands capture, betrayal, bullet, or rope. His death feels inevitable, not because fate is magical, but because his life narrows the possible endings. He has made too many enemies and placed too little value on mercy. Mercy is almost absent from Colm's story. He does not show it to Annabelle. His men do not show it to Jake Adler. They do not show it to Kieran. They do not show it to Arthur. The law does not show it to him. Dutch, Arthur, and Sadie make sure no rescue interrupts the sentence. The absence of mercy becomes the air around him. He lived in that air, and at the end he breathes it himself. This is why Colm's law can be told calmly, but not tenderly. There is no need to soften him into a misunderstood soul. The sleepiness of the telling comes from distance and rhythm, not from pretending the man was gentle. He is a cold part of the story, but cold things can still be understood slowly. A winter night can be described softly, without making the cold warm. Colm O'Driscoll belongs to that kind of telling. He is a man shaped by revenge, but never lifted beyond it. He is a leader who commands many, but seems loved by few. He is Dutch's enemy, but also Dutch's warning. He is Sadie's nightmare, Kieran's curse, Arthur's captor, and a symbol of outlaw life without romance. His story begins before the game and ends on a platform, but the damage he causes moves through nearly every major emotional thread in the first half and beyond. Colm's leadership can be read as practical nihilism. He does not appear to believe the world is becoming better. He does not speak as if he will build a new society. He does not promise Tahiti, freedom, or moral revolution. His gang survives by taking, trapping, and replacing. That makes him less delusional than Dutch in one sense, but more spiritually empty in another. Dutch's dream is false, but at least it contains a dream. Colm's world is mostly appetite. Appetite is an important word for the O'Driscolls. They take shelter, take lives, take revenge, take prisoners, take chances, and take space. Their movement through the story often feels hungry, not elegant, not ideological, not even especially joyful. Hungry, this hunger gives the gang its rough menace. They are men who will use whatever is near: a homestead, a captured rival, a defector's body, a rooftop sniper, a ranch. Colm's leadership teaches hunger as method. Fear is the other method. Colm's men are feared by enemies and by some of their own. Kieran's behaviour suggests that the gang kept him through pressure rather than affection. The O'Driscoll name makes people tense because fear has been cultivated. Fear can hold a gang together for a time. It can make men obey orders, keep secrets, and follow a leader who might otherwise be abandoned. But fear does not create the same resilience as love. On the gallows, that difference matters. Dutch's gang, for all its corruption, has people willing to risk themselves from love. Arthur risks himself for John. Hosea risks for the family. Sadie risks for those she chooses. Charles risks for what is right. The O'Driscolls risk too, but the story rarely frames that risk as tenderness. It feels like gang momentum, obligation, or fear. Colm's rescue plan fails partly because there is no deeper emotional miracle underneath it. This does not mean Colm's men feel nothing. It means the story chooses not to centre their feeling, because Colm's system has flattened them. That flattening is a form of tragedy. A gang of replaceable men may contain individual grief, but the organisation has no room to honour it. The O'Driscoll boys are dangerous, partly because they have already accepted, or been forced to accept, a world where their individuality barely matters. Colm's unnamed brother is the one exception we hear about, the one O'Driscoll-related life whose death clearly matters to Colm, yet even he is not given a name. This is strangely fitting. Colm's brother may have been the last personal wound before Colm's grief became institutionalised into feud. The brother disappears into a role, the dead man Dutch killed. His individuality is lost, and the revenge machine remains. Annabelle is also absorbed into role, though with more tenderness through Dutch's memory. She becomes the murdered lover, the proof of Colm's cruelty, the old wound Dutch cannot release. Neither Annabelle nor Colm's brother gets to exist fully in the present story. They are transformed by surviving men into reasons. This is one of the saddest things about revenge. It often turns the dead into tools, even when it claims to honour them. Colm's revenge against Annabelle is particularly cruel because it targets the person who may have had the least direct responsibility for Dutch's killing of his brother. This is the logic of feud at its worst. The goal is not proportion or justice. The goal is pain. Dutch hurt Colm through family, so Colm hurts Dutch through love. Human beings become messages sent between violent men. Annabelle's life is stolen, so Colm can make Dutch feel the shape of loss. That message succeeds too well. Dutch never forgets. But because Dutch does not transform the memory into wisdom, the loss becomes another reason to keep performing rage. Colm may have wanted to wound Dutch permanently, and he did. The dark irony is that Dutch's wound then helps endanger everyone around him. Colm's revenge spreads beyond Dutch into the lives of people who had nothing to do with the original killing. The feud's emotional mathematics are impossible. One brother for one lover, one ambush for another, one torture for another slight, one hanging watched by old enemies. No equation returns balance. The numbers never settle, because grief cannot be counted that way. Colm's life is a case study in the failure of revenge as accounting. It keeps adding deaths and calling the sum justice. This is why Colm and Dutch are both trapped by the past. Dutch wants a future, but he keeps dragging old wounds into it. Colm wants survival, but his old hatred keeps him tied to Dutch. The two men are like anchors for each other. They make each other heavier. Even when other threats grow more important, neither can fully resist the pull of the feud. Colm's eventual hanging cuts one anchor loose, but by then, Dutch is already sinking for other reasons. The possibility of peace between them is almost absurd by 1899. Too much has happened. Too many men have died. Too many identities depend on the feud continuing. Blessed Are the Peacemakers is powerful because its title points towards something spiritually impossible for these men. Peace would require humility, confession, and a willingness to stop using the dead as weapons. Colm has no interest in that. Dutch likely has no real capacity for it either. Colm's decision to use peace as a trap is therefore perfectly in character. He does not merely reject peace, he corrupts the idea of peace into a tactic. That makes the mission title bitter. The peacemaker language becomes bait for violence. Arthur's suffering is born from a false meeting under a false hope. Colm's world does not allow sacred words to remain sacred. Everything can be turned into leverage. Leverage is one of his defining concepts. Annabelle is leverage against Dutch's heart. Arthur is leverage against Dutch's loyalty. Kieran's body is leverage against camp morale. His own planned rescue uses rooftop position, crowd, and timing as leverage against law. Colm thinks in angles of pressure. He wants to know where a person can be pushed until others move. This is the intelligence beneath his brutality. That intelligence makes him more frightening than a simple sadist. A sadist enjoys pain. Colm may enjoy it, but he also uses it. Pain becomes instrument. Fear becomes signal. Bodies become messages. The O'Driscoll boys function as a language of threat, and Colm is fluent in that language. He does not need eloquent speeches, because the violence speaks for him. Dutch's language, by contrast, is verbal and theatrical. He persuades with rhythm, ideals, and emotional performance. Colm persuades with danger. Both forms are manipulative. Dutch makes people feel chosen. Colm makes people feel trapped. A person might die for Dutch because love and identity demand it. A person might die for Colm because fear and gang obligation leave no clean exit. The results in graves can look disturbingly similar. This similarity is one of the reasons Kieran's line about the gangs not being so different hurts. He sees from the outside what the van der Lindes do not want to see. The van der Lindes are warmer, yes, more human, yes, but they still threaten, kidnap, rob and kill. Kieran's perspective is shaped by Colm's cruelty, yet it gives him clarity. Having lived under one violent leader, he can recognise patterns in another camp. The van der Lindes hate that comparison because it attacks their self-image. They need the O'Driscolls to be the bad gang, so they can remain the better gang. Kieran complicates this by being an O'Driscoll who is not monstrous. Colm complicates it by being monstrous enough to make the comparison comforting again. The story lives inside that push and pull. The van der Lindes are not O'Driscolls, but that does not make them free of O'Driscoll, like violence. Colm's gang gives Dutch a convenient moral flaw. No matter how bad Dutch becomes, he can point to Colm and say, "At least we are not that." But moral flaws are dangerous when they become excuses. If the only standard is being better than the worst person nearby, decay can go very far before anyone admits it. Horseshoe, Clemens Point, Shady Bell and Beaver Hollow all trace that decay. By the time Colm dies, the van der Linde gang has lost much of the warmth that once distinguished it. Hosea and Lenny are dead, Dutch is paranoid, Micah is close, Arthur is sick, Molly is dead, Kieran is dead. The old family feeling is breaking. Colm's hanging arrives almost too late to matter emotionally. The external enemy is removed after the internal damage has become irreversible. This timing is brilliant because it prevents revenge from becoming the climax of the whole story. Colm's death would be a climax in a simpler outlaw tale. The old rival finally hangs, the feud ends, the hero can breathe. But Red Dead Redemption 2 uses that moment differently. Colm dies, and the story continues downward. The message is clear: old enemies are not the only reason people fall apart. Sadie's reaction to Colm's death is also not the end of her pain. She can see him hang, help kill his remaining men later, and still remain restless. This is psychologically honest. Revenge can complete an action without completing grief. Sadie gets justice in one sense, but she does not get Jake back or her old self back. Colm's death gives her a point of satisfaction, not a full healing. Kieran gets no such satisfaction. He dies before Colm hangs. He never sees the leader of his old gang brought down. This absence is sad because Kieran was one of Colm's quietest victims. He escaped the O'Driscolls, helped the van der Lindes, and still died under the old name's violence. Colm's execution comes too late for him. That lateness is another way the story avoids easy justice. Arthur's justice against Colm is also incomplete. He survives torture and later helps make sure Colm dies, but Arthur's own death comes from a different source: Thomas Downes, Strauss's debts, and the life Arthur served. Colm hurt Arthur badly, but he is not Arthur's deepest reckoning. This distinction keeps the story from becoming a revenge fantasy. The man who tortures Arthur is not the man who forces Arthur to face his soul. Colm's place in Arthur's moral story is therefore pressure, not centre. He pressures Arthur physically and emotionally. He exposes danger. He fuels the gang's cycles. But Arthur's redemption is about seeing beyond feud. Arthur does not become better because he hates Colm harder. He becomes better because he learns to help John, Abigail, Jack, the Downes family, and others despite the life he lived. Colm belongs to the old world Arthur must move beyond. The old world is visible in the O'Driscoll camps. Men around fires, stolen goods, crude shelters, rough talk, guns ready, loyalty enforced by threat. It is easy to imagine such camps dotting the dying West, each with its own leader, grudges, and little economy of theft. Colm's gang represents that world in mass. The Van der Lindes represent it in intimacy. Both are being squeezed by railroads, banks, oil, law, and the narrowing frontier. Colm's failure to adapt is different from Dutch's. Dutch adapts rhetorically, always finding new speeches for old behaviour. Colm adapts tactically, using traps, numbers, and rescue plans. Neither adapts morally, neither can stop the core pattern of violence. That is why both are doomed. The world changes, but they remain committed to methods that keep producing enemies faster than safety. The O'Driscoll boys' repeated clashes with law are less central than their clashes with Dutch, but law is always waiting in the background. Colm is ultimately captured and sentenced, meaning the state eventually succeeds where Dutch's feud did not. This is another sign of the changing era. Personal revenge may fail for years, but bureaucratic law, once it catches a man, can set a date and build a scaffold. The scaffold is the opposite of the ambush. An ambush is sudden, hidden, chaotic, and private to those involved. A scaffold is scheduled, public, vertical, and ceremonial. Colm's life of ambush ends in a scaffold, which feels like the world turning his own methods inside out. He spent years making other people helpless, unexpectedly. The law makes him helpless at an appointed hour, before witnesses. The crowd at his execution deserves attention, because it shows society's appetite for outlaw death. People gather not only for justice, but for spectacle. This complicates the moral comfort of the scene. Colm is guilty, but the crowd's watching is not pure holiness. Red Dead Redemption 2 often shows that civilization condemns violence while also staging it for public consumption. Colm's death becomes entertainment, warning, and civic ritual all at once. Dutch, Arthur, and Sadie, hidden among or around this ritual, create an odd alliance with the state. They are outlaws helping an execution succeed, not because they trust the law, but because the law's violence aligns with their desire. This moment shows how flexible moral positions become when revenge is near. The same people who flee law can use law. The same gallows Dutch might fear for himself becomes acceptable when Colm stands on it. Colm's final fear, then, is surrounded by many kinds of hypocrisy and truth. He truly deserves consequence. The law truly has power. Dutch truly hates him. Sadie truly needs to see him fall. Arthur truly has reason to help. The crowd truly enjoys the spectacle. None of these truths cancel the others. The scene is powerful because it lets justice, revenge, fear, and public cruelty occupy the same square. After the drop, Colm's body becomes still, but the emotional motion continues in everyone else. Sadie carries grief forward, Dutch carries his decay, Arthur carries his sickness and final purpose. The remaining O'Driscolls carry disorganisation and violence until they are cleared away. A death in Red Dead Redemption 2 rarely stops the story. It redirects the current. The current after Colm runs toward the gang's last collapse. By Chapter 6, the O'Driscolls are no longer the main danger. That shift matters. Colm's death closes the old feud, just as Dutch's internal collapse becomes impossible to ignore. It is almost as if the story removes the external rival, so there is nowhere left to hide from the truth inside camp. Without Colm, Dutch cannot define himself as the better outlaw leader as easily. The mirror is gone, and Dutch still looks worse. This is why Colm's role continues after his death through absence. When he is gone, the story does not feel safer. It feels more exposed. The enemy outside is dead, but the enemy inside remains. Micah's influence, Dutch's paranoia, Arthur's illness, and the Pinkertons become clearer. Colm's absence creates space for the final tragedy to show its true shape. The O'Driscoll boys fading from the story also makes the map feel changed. Areas once associated with their threat become quieter or are occupied by other forces. This is how the game gives time a physical feeling. Gangs rise, move, die, and leave spaces behind. Colm's organisation seemed large, but it was still temporary. The land outlasts the name. That temporary nature is humbling. Colm may have commanded many men, terrified rivals, and haunted Dutch for years. But in the end, his gang is one more violent arrangement passing through a larger history. The trees remain, the ranches remain, the roads remain. Other gangs come, law expands. New troubles take old places. Colm's name was loud for a while, then the world made room for other sounds. This does not make his victims small. If anything, it makes them more important. The world may move on, but Sadie's life is permanently altered. Kieran's life ends. Annabelle remains a wound. Jake Adler remains a ghost. Arthur carries scars. The scale of history can shrink a villain's legacy, but personal grief keeps it enormous for those touched directly. Colm is both historically replaceable and personally devastating. That duality is very Red Dead. The age is changing, and no outlaw is as important as he thinks. Yet every act of violence matters terribly to someone. Colm is not important enough to stop modernisation, but he is important enough to ruin lives. That is the scale of most human evil in the game. Not cosmic, not all-powerful, but devastating within reach. The most important thing to remember is that Colm's danger is not only in what he personally does, it is in what he permits, what he organises, what he encourages, and what his name allows others to become. A gang leader creates a climate. Under Dutch, the climate is warm enough to love and unstable enough to destroy. Under Colm, the climate is cold enough that men become replaceable. Adler Ranch, Kieran's death, Arthur's torture, and the O'Driscoll camps all grow from that climate. When the climate finally collapses, no one mourns it with tenderness. Colm hangs. Sadie and Arthur strike Hanging Dog Ranch. The O'Driscoll boys fade, yet the world remains wounded. That is the honest ending for a man like Colm. His death is necessary, perhaps satisfying, but not restorative. The wounds he made do not close, just because the rope tightened. And now, as the fire lowers and the night grows still, the story of Colm O'Driscoll can settle into its final shape. He was the rival in the snow, the old enemy behind Dutch's grief, the leader of men who moved like a swarm through the dying West. He was the name behind ruined homes, frightened defectors, cruel traps, and revenge that lasted too many years. He stood on the gallows, believing his boys would save him, and in the last moment understood that the world he built had no mercy left for him either. Let the O'Driscoll camps fall quiet now. Let the hoofbeats fade from the ridge. Let Sadie ride away from the smoke. Let Kieran's memory rest softer than the name forced onto him. And let Arthur keep moving toward the choices that still matter. Colm's story is over. The road is quiet. Rest now, and let the dark take the old feud away.